Hello and welcome to the Scuttlebutt Podcast, the podcast for current and former service members looking to be challenged and to grow. I'm your host, Brock Briggs, and today I'm speaking with Chris Ingram. Chris's background is in trade and foreign policy, but joined the Army infantry for a profession. We talk about how he has seen foreign policy develop in the last 20 years across a civilian job on Capitol Hill, and then throughout his time deployed in the Middle East. Chris talks about his stint as a speechwriter for a senior officer and the things he learned about how to communicate more effectively. And last, we dive into the Military Writers Guild, of whom Chris is the president, and why writing is one of the best things you can do for yourself. Please enjoy this conversation with Chris Ingram. We were just talking a few minutes ago about your career and how you've had kind of a little bit of a backwards career than the traditional one. You pursued sort of a career in on Capitol Hill in politics of some sort, and then joined the Army. And usually that's the other way around. What gets you interested to pursue a job in politics early on in your life?
So, back in the day. So I've always been interested in foreign policy and international relations. In high school, I did Model United Nations, went to high school in Germany, and so really got interested in foreign policy. And so as I graduated college and went up to DC to get my master's degree, sort of looking at the jobs and the interesting things to do out there, it took me to Capitol Hill. And that's where we started. So, and then like you mentioned, like put on the uniform later. Normally people put on the uniform to like build up a resume to go get into politics. That actually came at it from an opposite direction and really put on the uniform to escape politics.
You've spent like the greater part of the last like 20 years in that sphere. I know that you've kind of changed jobs technically, but I don't think that you really totally have like divorced that. If you had to sum up what foreign policy is in like a couple sentences, what does that actually mean?
It's how we as a nation sort of, use all the elements of power to kind of maintain our position of advantage in the world. How do we how do we take our values about free and open society and our goals about being prosperous and safe, and how do we turn that in? How do we maintain that?
Does that by default mean that we kind of, as the US, maybe believe that we have the right way of doing things?
I think we probably believe that. I think we get it wrong sometimes, and that's inherent. It's foreign policy or strategy or whatever you want to talk about. It's hard. It's about human conflict at the end of the day. It's about competing interests. It's about it becomes a wicked problem really because there's 100 something nations and everybody's got competing interests, and then you've got other super empowered individuals and other all sorts of organizations and things. And balancing all that, it's hard work. It's hard. It takes a lot of thought, and you're not going to always be right.
One of the things that, as I was preparing for the show, I was kind of spending some time thinking about what I thought foreign policy might mean. And to kind of pick up the line that you're dropping there is like, I was kind of wondering if the study of foreign policy is kind of a proxy for cultural psychology. Like, are you really just trying to, like you said, you've got 100 or so countries that all have different belief systems and ways that they think ought to be done. And you need to, on the belief that what you think is right, somehow convince these other people with a different background that it ought to be a different way.
Culture is probably something we get wrong the most in terms of foreign policy and strategy. Understanding, we're especially coming from a sort of a U.S. or even from a kind of a Western perspective, very rational. We have some different schools of thought, whether you're talking about realism or neoliberalism or that sort of thing. But we tend to think that the world thinks the way we do. And as I mentioned before, our foreign policy derives from our values, right? And our values are are derived from our culture. I think sometimes we fail to understand that, cultures that don't read Clausewitz and all of the Huntington and all the things that our society has read in the formulation of foreign policy might look at things differently than that. So as we compete, as we try to navigate these muddy waters of foreign policy, a lot of times we don't even recognize the interests of others because we're kind of blinded to their culture and what drives their interests and motivations.
One of the things that I wanted to kind of get your opinion on it, and maybe this is kind of the answer to part of it, but I'd love to hear what you think are the benefit of our foreign policy over the last 20 years, what the benefits to the United States has been, and maybe some of the downfalls of that as well.
Well, it's probably a good time for that disclaimer about nothing I say represents the Department of the Army or the United States government in any way, shape, or form. Just my personal opinion. So we've been in a unique position, since I started thinking about foreign policy of really being because I got into it early, post Cold Wars. We're trying to kind of figure out what was going on in the 90s. And we've been in a position of relative advantage, right, for the US. And so there's been an international rules based order that has been beneficial to us in general, right? I think there's certainly an argument to be made that there's some inequalities and some issues that even affect within our own society out of it. But overall, we've had a foreign policy that's been focused on maintaining that order as it comes under attack from different angles. And so I think that puts us in a difficult position as the U.S. government, right? Like as we try to maintain that position, it's going to be hard. And frankly, as we look forward, I'm not sure we're going to be able to maintain that position necessarily. The question now becomes as other powers grow. If you look at China, for instance, in terms of its economy, in terms of its military, they're going to be a competitor, and we're going to have to address that. And I think it comes down to looking at the structure and focusing on that. But
When you talk about maintaining and that power that you're talking about, are you referring to the US as kind of like a world power and like kind of a leader of the first world sort of?
I wouldn't use the first world term, but in terms of like free and open societies, if you look at democracies around the world, we have some shared interests, and the system, for the most part, benefits those types of societies. And again, that goes back to our cultural values and what we think is important, right? So if we're going to maintain that, sometimes we have to actually, sell it, right? Convince people that benefits them as well. But not everybody's going to see it the same way, and especially countries that have not fared as well over the last, 20 or 40 years. They might blame the system that's in place, and the international rules-based order, or liberal world order, what do you want to call it, we are benefiting from, and that creates challenges.
As the US has kind of maybe self-described, or however we want to figure how they came into this role as this kind of like hegemon in like the world ranking, it's interesting to talk to different people because everybody's got a different viewpoint about, we're helping our allies, we're doing these things, and then there are people on the other side of the aisle that want to say like we have absolutely no business being in anybody else's business. And I don't know if that there's an easy answer.
We have to be judicious in our resources. We have to be humble, I think, sometimes in our foreign policy, and that's not always a natural place for Americans to be. As an American who's lived abroad, you kind of notice, we tend to be the loud ones. It's not just our foreign policy; it's us as a people, part of our culture.
Mhm.
Probably always has been. I think we have to consider that, and we have to think about others and understand. If I want a country to start rowing in the same direction that we're rowing, I need to understand them and kind of meet them where they are.
What have been the major foreign policy or like world economic things, developments, I guess I should say, during your time in this space that have been the most interesting to you?
Well, the biggest thing the sort of is change, right? Change and disruption. Because so when we as we were talking about before we came on, I started out doing economic policy, right? Like why is this economic policy guy now joining the army and becoming a soldier, right? So when I started doing foreign policy as a professional and started thinking about how I could kind of work within that space within the US, it was globalization, right? That's what people were talking about. They were, the World Trade Organization protests and all of the things that were going on in the world in the late 1990s, very early, 2000, really up till the year 2000, 2001. And that's what we thought was going to be the next big challenge was globalization, was inequality. And that didn't go away, right? Like if you think about it, those challenges still exist, but 9/11 happened and it changed the direction. So I was working in the House at the time on the House Ways and Means Committee, it's a trade subcommittee, focused entirely on international trade. And within a few months after that, I got picked up to go to the Senate side and work as a foreign policy advisor for a senator who was on the Finance Committee. But she was also on the Intelligence Committee. And so now it was actually early 2003. And so even though I came into that space as an economic policy wonk who was, could talk about trade policy all day long as if it was something interesting to other people, as soon as I went to work for her, we're starting to look at questions about WMD in Iraq. And the whole focus had changed at that point. And now America was feeling a little bit less secure post 9/11. And so that changed our dynamics. And then, of course, we spent the last 20 years kind of dealing with that. And then now, we're realizing those economic inequality and other issues, the globalization issues never went away. So we're back to dealing with those. And then, while we were focused in Iraq and Afghanistan, Russia was finding itself and then trying to reassert itself and trying to reclaim its position on the global stage. And China just kept growing and their economy just kept advancing. They just kept investing in their military and they were watching us and they were adjusting to us while we were paying attention to other things. And then that's part of that foreign policy dilemma, right? Where you spend your resources, where you spend your energy, your focus. It's not always on the right threat, or it's on the right threat that you can't meet all the threats. You can't resource everything. And so you open yourself up to risk in other areas.
I think if somebody were to mention like the defense of our country or like the attack on another country by us, our first thought is going to be to the military and like using force in that way. But behind that, like maybe second to that is like we have this much more discreet weapon in trade that really sets the terms for like there are countries that are on the map because we trade with them. And
Mhm.
I mean the whole introduction of COVID and like what that did to supply chains, and then now this like globalization idea of having this dispersed just in time inventory thing. Now we want to bring it all back in. And just this week the government said to Nvidia, like, hey, stop sending chips to China. Like that's a trade weapon right
Yeah.
there.
So, one of my first job in DC actually was as an economic policy wonk was for the Trade Deficit Review Commission, right? It's like the 9/11 Commission, except we had less money and nobody read a report. But that's some of the stuff we were looking at is these trade imbalances and sort of security questions, and that commission ended up kind of transforming the next year to the U.S.-China Security and Economic Review Commission. So that was my second job. That commission's still in place, and what that commission's been looking at for all these years is this issue of we have this deep trading partnership and relationship, but that opens us up to some risk, right? So the international trading system, the coming out of Bretton Woods and General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization, right? This has created a level of interdependence that has benefited the United States. It's made us more prosperous, but at the same time has also made us more interdependent. And if you go back to the globalization issues, the world's getting smaller, and that's where some of these conflicts I think go back to the fact that we are so interconnected, and so we are conflicts in the past that may not have kind of turned into into more violent things or been as disruptive as they are. Now, something that happened, a plant in one country getting hit by a tsunami or a flood or something like that shuts down, that starts affecting supply chains and it starts affecting jobs in Alabama, right? And that happens within days. Suez Canal, one ship gets stuck, and the whole world thinks it's going to come to the end because supply chains get disrupted. We developed this just-in-time manufacturing where we had these really efficient supply chains, and so we became dependent on that efficiency. And then as things became disruptive, and that's where some of the issues of climate change and some of the other challenges are more acute than I think people realize, is because a climate issue, a hurricane or a flood that Pakistan right now has, an area larger than the size of Colorado that's underwater. All right, so years ago that wouldn't have affected us necessarily directly, but now with interdependent economies and manufacturing that's spread across the world, those things have second and third order effects that do affect us.
I've recently been reading some of Nassim Taleb's work around black swan events, and it's interesting to me looking at some of these global issues where prior to COVID there's people probably like you pointing out that, like, hey, we're really dependent on these countries, and if something bad happens, like, this isn't great, but the general consensus is that things are fine, and all it takes is supposedly one of these freak things to happen, and then all of a sudden, we're bringing every bit of manufacturing back home. Like, we just can't do that again. But
Yeah.
those things like happen so much more frequently than you actually think, and there's just they're impossible to predict.
Well, and there's trade-offs too, right? So you open yourself up to risk, but also America's more prosperous because of that global trade, right?
Mhm.
A lot of people like to knock Walmart, and trust me, there's plenty of things to knock about Walmart. You can say the same now about Amazon. But if you look at what people in the United States are able to afford, we're buying things that we couldn't have afforded years ago. And if we tried to manufacture those things in the United States, we wouldn't be able to afford it. The standard of living would be lower. People would have jobs, and there might be some other benefits to it. But at the end of the day, we've promoted a system because it benefits us. And that's where we just have to mitigate those risks and look at things a little bit differently, I think, than we have been.
It's easy for me to tell listening to you talk about this. Like, you're obviously very well informed on this, and you can tell that you've spent a lot of time studying this type of thing. What makes you want to get out of this and go join the infantry?
It goes back to disruption, right? So worked on Capitol Hill for a while. People joke about long hours in the military. I assure you, my hours when I worked on Capitol Hill were far worse than any job I've had in the Army. And so my son was born. Decided, hey, this is a great time to go get a PhD. So I went down to, applied to several schools. LSU gave me the best offer, so we moved down to Baton Rouge just in time for Hurricane Katrina. But if you think back to about the time that I was finishing up, so I took my comprehensive exams, we, were getting ready to do my dissertation research, but my fellowship money ran out. And at this point, I had a wife and 2 kids, mortgage, and, things to be concerned with. And it's, now it's 2009, we're in a recession. And so 2010, so universities around the country weren't hiring. The job market, the academic job market sort of fell out. And as I looked at what I wanted to do, part of my thinking was I needed a profession. So I had a lot of cool jobs early on in my career, working in the House, working in the Senate. That first job at the Trade Deficit Review Commission, first person who ever yelled at me professionally was Don Rumsfeld, right? This was before he was Secretary of Defense. That's how old I am. They were cool jobs, but very insecure, right? Very, lots of different jobs. And I needed something that, like, I was growing up at this point. Now I need, like, what's my retirement plan? What's my pension plan? And so I looked at the Army as an opportunity. This was, now we're in the middle of wars. We were fighting both in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. And it was a chance for someone who's been thinking about foreign policy, who's been thinking about international relations. It was really an opportunity for me to, one, provide for my family, and join a profession that allows me to go do what I'm interested in. It's all conflict, right? Economics are conflict and competition. You do it with guns or you do it with dollars, but when you really start to think about it, even trade is conflict, right? You've got a Snickers bar, I want it. You're not going to give me that Snickers bar, but I've got a dollar and you want that dollar. If you want that dollar more than you want the Snickers bar, we've just bargained and we've figured out how to solve a conflict between the two of us. The same thing applies as you start to go from that micro level to the macro level. I probably think about war a little bit differently than most people coming from that kind of economics background. But at the end of the day, it's conflict.
Did you have any beliefs about the war in Afghanistan, the economic relations with Afghanistan that were drastically changed after you joined the army?
No, I don't think so. I certainly looked at Afghanistan as a country that would be challenging, right? Like from an economic standpoint, it meets all the criteria. It was a failed state for a reason, and it wasn't just because of extremist political views. It was a failed state because of its location. The tyranny of geography for Afghanistan has been a challenge for them their entire existence. So, it has its own development problems that we weren't going to be able to go in and solve. In some sense, and Afghanistan is where I did, my platoon leader time. We were doing the best we could, and we're trying to, solve the problem in my little area of operations. But it was a deeper problem, I think, than we realized as a country we were getting into. We were, a lot of people look at, talk about Afghanistan and Iraq. People kind of look at Afghanistan sometimes as the right war, right? Because we were responding to 9/11, and Iraq is sort of looked at a little differently. But they're also two very different countries, right? Iraq has, which is a place that I've been fairly recently, but Iraq has, fairly solid education level. It has a civil, sort of, civic society, and it has bureaucrats and administrators and people who know how to run a government, and it has some resources, and it has better geography a little bit. So it's a different problem set, and that's why yes, there's a lot of problems in Baghdad right now, and they're still fighting over kind of figure out who the next government's going to be because of the cultural and sort of other challenges they have. But they have a much better chance, I think, going forward than Afghanistan does, just from a development standpoint.
Why did you choose the infantry?
I've asked myself that many times. So there were a couple of things. One, when I joined the army, I knew I was doing it for a living. Right? There was never a question in my mind when I joined that I was going to be in for at least 20 years. So I really was kind of playing the long game from the very beginning. I didn't, I've had cool jobs. I didn't join the army to get work experience. So as I looked at what would set me up in the long term, and I knew at the time as well that I wanted to be a strategist, but you can't be a strategist in the army until you make major. There are no jobs for it for obvious reasons. It's a job that requires some experience. So I looked at infantry as one, we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. So I knew as a young officer, my best opportunity to lead would be as an infantry officer. As I looked at counterinsurgency and was kind of thinking about sort of who makes a difference in that, I had a lot of people like, "Oh, why didn't you go into MI, or, intelligence?" And part of the reason I didn't is because, especially as a lieutenant, right? Like you're giving people advice as an intelligence officer, but at the end of the day, it's an infantry officer or an infantryman who's leading their unit that walks outside the wire and has to make those rapid decisions that really are the heart of war, of conflict. And so I felt like being an infantry officer early would give me that experience. And then also, if you look at the long game of who influences the army, most of the general officers come from combat arms. And so if I'm going to be a strategist whose job is to advise those individuals, that CIB that's on my uniform brings a little bit of credibility with it. And then that also, I will also say that I come from a family of military. So I am third generation OCS. My grandfather was an infantry officer. He was a platoon leader, Battle of the Bulge, and a battalion commander in I. So there was a legacy there that I had kind of grown up around and seen, and it meant a lot to me.
I'm sure that when you didn't immediately go off to college and then the army, or vice versa, like that was probably kind of like a maybe a little bit of a letdown from your dad and grandpa, like at the beginning, if that was your paternal. But then you like were able to come back just much later on, which I think is really interesting.
My
Um,
brother and I both, I don't know why, but my brother and I, so my parents, my dad and my grandfather both retired as colonels. My dad never once tried to encourage me to join the military. In fact, when I talked about joining the military, he tried to convince me to join the Air Force. So there was never a sense of that, but I do think there was a sense, at least in me, that kind of held that in higher esteem. My hero is my grandfather. So if we want to be like our heroes sometimes, that was probably an underlying reason that I joined.
I'm curious the dynamics of you joining a little bit later. So you joined in 2011, and at this point you have your doctorate, right? How old are
No, so
you?
I didn't finish it.
Oh, you didn't finish it.
I
Okay.
didn't. Second lieutenant infantry is not conducive to doing dissertation research. So
Yeah.
I timed out. Didn't. I'm all but dissertation, so ABD. So you know, I paid all that money and learned a good bit about international relations and political science, but I don't have the paper to show anyone for it.
As a side note, are you able to go back and like do the dissertation to finish it?
No, no, but honestly, I will go back to school at some point and get a PhD. Most likely, it's something in the long term is a goal of mine. But going back to that PhD and to that dissertation is kind of past, right? And
Mhm.
both time wise, I can't go back, but also as I learn more, it probably changes my focus and my area of interest.
How old were you when you joined then?
I turned 32 in basic training.
Oh, wow. Okay. So
Yeah.
that is kind of a dynamic that I want to unpack a little bit. I'm imagining and trying to like put myself in your shoes a little bit here. You're a newly commissioned infantry officer, and I bet probably two personas. We've got the ones right out of school that are trying to like charge ahead and like make decisions because and just be that leader because they feel
Mhm.
like they need to. And then I imagine that you're probably eager to lead, but not just like bossing people for no reason. You've got this wealth of knowledge and experience to kind of like back it. Do you think that you were given a different level of credence just because of your prior experience?
I think the maturity helped. I think the background certainly helped, but it also hurt. So, infantry is a young man's game. Ranger school is not designed for people in their 30s, which is why I don't have a Ranger tab. And so, there were some absolute challenges that I probably wouldn't have had if I had gone a branch besides infantry, right? And for many reasons why we expect our infantry officers, because of the positions that they're in and the requirements of the job, to be very physically fit. And it wasn't that I wasn't physically fit; it's just that it's different. It's different in your 30s. PT hits a little different, and so that was a challenge. I think the maturity helped. Even we mentioned sort of doing things backwards. Like I was an XO before I was a platoon leader. I there were from the very beginning there were positions that I got put into, or opportunities, you want to call it that, that I was given based on maturity and based on a level of trust with my leadership in terms of my judgment and my ability to kind of think through problems.
Did joining humble you in any way that you didn't expect?
Absolutely. It's hard to go from owning your second home, I think, at that point, to living in a bay with 40 other dudes and basic training. Like it absolutely is humbling, but in good ways. And I'll say the same, same thing for being an infantry officer as a platoon leader, right? There were challenges that I had that, but a little humility is good for you.
We're going to get into a little bit of the your love of writing later when we talk about the Writers Guild, but at what point does writing become a meaningful part of your life? Is it at a
So
point here in the army, or was it even before?
no, no, I meant like the I mentioned before the first job at the Trade Deficit Review Commission. Like my first job out of college was writing a chapter in that report. And if you think about I used to tell my students this when I taught political science. In the foreign policy realm, it doesn't, and this probably applies in other jobs too, but it doesn't matter if you know something. It doesn't matter if you're right. You have to be able to explain it, and that comes through oral communication, but also most of the time it comes in writing. You have to be able to explain the problem and explain, what you're trying to do or what your recommendation is. And so writing became very important for me early on. Certainly, I was forced very early on to improve my writing as a form of communication in the social sciences and in foreign policy. And then working in the Senate, I was writing questions. I was writing talking points for a senator who was getting ready to go on CNN and talk about, why we need to send forces into Iraq. So, got some very early lessons on the importance of writing well, and then took that into the Army.
You said that you had the opportunity to be a speechwriter while you were in. I'm guessing
Mhm.
that your background in and way with words probably had a way to bring that about. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I'll probably credit some of that to the Writers Guild as well, and sort of that community of writers that have helped me improve. Right, the only way you get better at writing is by doing it, and so I've kind of forced myself over time to write things and to think through things and to publish, because it really forces you to think through a problem if you think other people are going to read your writing. And so when the job opportunity came open, they were looking for somebody to be a speechwriter for the commanding general of Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, which is our counter ISIS fight there in Iraq and Syria right now. I threw my name in the hat, did some interviews, and got selected to go be a speechwriter.
What all is involved with being a speechwriter? Do you just tag along with whoever it is that you're with and just take notes and put together nice things? Like I'm trying to like mentally
No,
put an image
that
together of what that looks like.
I wish it was easy to explain. So the thing about you have to remember, and again, I had the same experience working in the House and the Senate. When you start working around people at that level, it becomes very personality driven, right? The organization of a Senate office is based on the personality of the senator, right? So a commanding general's staff and kind of what they do and what their roles and functions are. Yes, there's some standards, right? The aide does this, the XO does that, the SGS does this, but it really becomes about the person. So, and speechwriter is probably the most so in that case, because a lot of general officers are very comfortable speaking. Or a lot of general officers are very comfortable. They don't want talking points going into a meeting, and then there are others who do, who kind of want to be more deliberate about that process. And so, for instance, going into that position, the previous commanding general didn't use a speechwriter. It didn't have a commander's initiative group, which is usually a small group within the command general staff that kind of helps them with engagements and talking points and readouts, coming out of the meeting that then feed into future engagements. So going into the job, I didn't know what I would do. I knew there would be writing involved. I didn't, but you really have to kind of learn on the job. And as soon as I got selected for the position, I reached out, and there's some other speech writers out there that I spoke to, and you all have different experiences. Some of the keys are, yes, you mentioned following the boss around. You have to be in the room. If you want to be able to, speechwriter's job is not to write well. A speechwriter's job is to write so that the boss is the best version of themselves. It doesn't matter how I want to say something or how I would communicate it, right? You really have to pick up their voice so that, and even their logic sometimes, so that what they're saying is them. And so you really have to learn your boss. Being in the room. So as I got picked up for that job, General Calvert, just an awesome guy to work for, he wanted a speechwriter. He wanted a SIG, so he wanted a commander's initiative group. He wanted people that would help him kind of think through big problems and articulate them very carefully, right? Because if you think about, it's a combined organization there, a joint task force as well. So you've got a lot of different cultures and a lot of different people you're communicating with every day. And foreign policy a lot of times comes down to words. It comes down to how you say them, and so it's important. So he wanted that, and he brought me in. I was his shadow for the entire time that I was there, traveling around Iraq and Syria. If he was in a meeting, almost every case I was in there as well, taking notes, which helps because as you're writing down what the boss says, you write it down because he said it 20 times. You get pretty good at what he likes to say.
Just picturing like trying to have to write something through another person's voice. Like you almost need to like shut down how you think about things, and you're needing to use words and put them together in sentences like the other person, because it's going to be very blatantly obvious if the person is reading something and it's like, I know that they didn't even have a hand in reading this beforehand, or somebody handed them a piece of paper and this doesn't even sound like words that they say.
Yes, and the audience, a lot of times the audience can see through that, right?
Yeah.
And also it becomes uncomfortable for the boss, right? It becomes uncomfortable for the principal in terms of it doesn't come out naturally. So yeah, you do have to. I don't communicate the same way General Calvert does. He's much better storyteller than I am, but you have to think, you have to start thinking like the boss. And if you have that close relationship, I had an amazing relationship with him, certainly a high level of trust that kind of let me be there as a fly on the wall. And you pick up the voice. You have to be deliberate about it, but it's something that if you're in the room, you can do.
I'm sure that you have more, maybe more than anybody else, completely understand the power of words and like words on paper and the spoken word as well. What have you learned in your years writing, but then also as a speechwriter, that would help people articulate and put together their thoughts in a convincing manner and deliver that in a way that's compelling?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to think about your audience, right? Who are you speaking to? So, power is influence, and words are the way that one of the primary ways we influence people. And you have to know, and this gets back to that discussion earlier about culture, right? You have to understand the motivations, the interests, the culture of the audience that you're speaking to, is that's going to, not just the voice of the person who's giving the speech, but also what they say. So it doesn't matter if you're writing a speech or if you're writing an article for a journal, right? It's who is your audience? Who are you trying to influence? What are you trying to change? And who could make those changes? And then how do they receive information?
Do you have any best practices or like a ritual that you would highly endorse to people? That not a lot of people are writing speeches, surely, but I think that if people put more thought into how they say and how they deliver it, I think that communication would be much more effective generally. There's so much misunderstanding in our world, but I was just wondering if there's maybe how you outline things or how you think about going into preparing something like that.
Well, the first thing I'd say is be more organized than me.
Do as I
That was
say, not as I
something.
do.
Well, no, but that was something, especially going into that job where I knew I was going to be a note taker and just taking voluminous notes. Like I had to, I had to build a system. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the way that I take notes. It wasn't the way that I think through things. But I had to be far more deliberate about being organized because I'm not. I'm not organized at all. The thing I would say about writing is you're telling a story, right? And if you think about writing as a story, you think about the fact that you got to get their attention. You got to kind of show them where you're going, right? You got to have a plot to your writing. So whether it's an essay or a poem or a thing, there's a plot to it. And where's that story going?
I think that that intentionality early on would go a long ways, and people just in even an everyday conversation with people. 'Cause like I said, we misunderstand each other so much, and that
Mhm.
results in so much kind of turmoil. I have a couple more questions about your time in the army, and then we can talk a little bit more about writing with the Writers Guild. What do you think were your large takeaways from spending time in Afghanistan?
Probably the humanity of it all.
What does that mean?
We think about war and conflict, and but when you're there, when you're in the middle of it, you think about the face of the 7-year-old girl who got blown up by an ID and that you had to bring into the outpost and try to treat and try to take care of, right? Like it certainly brings home the humanity, and really by humanity, you mean the inhumanity of war, the cost. If you feel it on such a deeper level, I think, than you would otherwise. The other takeaway I had was that people are people, and it's hard sometimes. I think there's a tendency for us to kind of think about people differently, but from different cultures, different societies. Like Afghanistan was different. Afghanistan was so different than what we see here in the United States. But at the same time, if you open your eyes, if you listen to the stories, if you listen to the complaints, if you sat in the shura and really listened to what they wanted, it was the same things we want. Right? They wanted to be safe. They wanted to be secure, and they wanted to be prosperous. And they were put in a dilemma that I can't imagine, where they don't know who's gonna which side of this violent conflict is gonna win, who's gonna and they got to live there. I think back, some of the kids that we were with then, probably a lot of them are dead. Probably a lot of them, some of them are probably fighting with the Taliban right now. Just that survival instinct that's really deeply human.
Did you have any takeaways on how you or what you saw it took to be a better soldier?
I think, and it kind of gets back to that same point, right? I think we have to be, tactically proficient. We have to be good at what we do, right? And that takes a lot of effort. But we also have to understand the why. We have to understand the repercussions, and that's hard. I think there's a lot of people that went to Afghanistan or Iraq that are still struggling with what they saw and some of the decisions they made. And we talk sometimes about building more ethical leaders and building people who got to think through the moral dilemmas. But the reality is, most of us dealt with those things for the first time after we got there, and had to think through things that we weren't expected to, certainly weren't prepared for.
The military has a funny way of putting you in situations and around things that you never would have expected.
Yeah.
Uh, some for the good, some for maybe the not so good. But think that lot of growth opportunities. That's for sure.
It is. It is. I've certainly learned a lot. I still today. We had a conversation earlier today where we're reflecting back on a moral decision that was made in Afghanistan over 10 years ago. Right? Like that's something that you learn, you grow from.
Got one more question about the Army. If you had the power to change one Army regulation today, what would it be and why?
Well, it wasn't raining today, or I would have said, why can't we carry an umbrella in uniform? Oh, that's kind of silly. No, in terms of regulate, well, there. I think that we get hung up sometimes on professional, right? So our image of the professional is, you think about it, really based on almost like a 1950s. This is what a soldier looks like. Really, maybe it comes out of World War II. I don't know, but it's our profession, right? We own it, and we get to decide, in a sense, what professional is and what it looks like. So I think sometimes when we're having our discussions and debates about uniform regulations and hair regulations and that sort of thing, people will fall back on that. Well, that doesn't look professional. Well, are you a professional? Right? If you're a professional in the profession of arms, professions police themselves, right? So we kind of get to decide, I think, what that is. I think I've been very impressed. I think over the last several years, we've started to make some more common sense decisions, some more inclusive decisions about some of those uniform regulations. But I still think there's some work to do, and in my hands feel really comfortable in my pockets. So,
What's been the most common sense regulation that's changed in the last couple of years?
well, the easiest one, it was the ridiculously easiest one, was the requirement to wear white socks in physical fitness uniform. Right now, you can wear black socks; it'll be okay. You might run. Who knows? You might run faster. And the funny thing is, if you look at a PT formation, and I try to avoid them, but if you look at a PT formation right now, nobody's wearing white socks. Like, they're all wearing black socks.
Right.
And it didn't cost the Army anything. It didn't. But the one that I think was the kind of the most valuable was some of the changes about women and how they wear their hair. The fact that we expected women to wear their hair in such a way that they looked just like men in formation, right? So their hair was tightened up and in buns, like it just didn't make sense. And so, letting women, kind of trusting women to wear their hair the way they want to, I think was a very valuable decision. I think it'll make us a better army.
That was kind of a surprise to me. There's, I think, some junior officers in the class next to me. I just started back at school this week, and there's a couple female officers that are soon to be officers that had their hair like down in a ponytail, and I was like, huh, like that must be a new thing.
The funny, and this is Army sends you to weird places, right? So when the Army was having this debate a year or so ago, I was in Iraq, and so it was a combined joint task force, right? So we had Italian, we had Spanish, we had Canadian, we had all these other services, and it kind of caught my attention. I started taking pictures, but almost every time I got in a helicopter, my door gunner had a ponytail.
Yeah,
I was just as safe, right? Like, and even in the Army, before we started saying ponytails, like, oh well, but not in combat. Oh, not in this. No, she was wearing a ponytail. She was hooked in the back, because gunners have to be hooked in, and she didn't keep them from doing their jobs. So,
right.
and the same thing, I get a little annoyed when people are like, well, what about beards, right? Because we think that if someone else gets something, we should get something too. But if you look at the Canadian, you look at some of the European military, the men wear beards, and it doesn't make them less professional. It doesn't make them worse at their jobs. At that, I think sometimes we're focusing on the wrong thing when we define a professional by appearance.
Give me the breakdown on the Military Writers Guild. What is it? How are you involved? How did it come to be? Give me the spiel.
So probably about, I don't know, I can't remember exactly when it happened now. Probably about 7 or 8 years ago. It started on Twitter. It started with a group of folks on Mill Twitter. Back, I jokingly call them the OG Mill Twitter folks, and a lot of them they were writing and they were publishing, but they kind of recognized the need. If you think about it, you go back, especially 10 years ago, there's a stigma about writing sometimes in the military. There is sort of sometimes this sort of anti-intellectual bias from an organization that's very focused on, combat and field, muddy boots kind of leadership. So thinking about the profession of writing it needed a community, it needed a community of support and also a community of practice, right? So community of practice kind of helps each other get better, right? I don't send something off to publication unless I've had two or three other people look at it and be like, yeah, that makes sense. Or yeah, you probably ought to rethink how you said that part online, that third paragraph. You might want to clean that up. So it helps to have that kind of community. And so that they set it up. It started out as a very small group of folks, and then it kind of grew out from there. Because it started on Twitter, it actually went international pretty soon. So we have members in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, obviously, the UK, India as well. So it grew pretty quickly. And now we have, years later, we have several hundred members. Part of our challenge as an organization, so several years ago, so I've been on the board now for, I think, 60 years or so. And so early on, we started to realize, okay, this is growing, it's growing fast, but we needed a structure. We needed a funding mechanism. So a few years ago, Gary Klein and I and the other members of the board put in the work and created a nonprofit organization. And then now we've been working on sort of the bylaws and the other things we need to do to really make it a functioning organization. But I've been president here the last 4 years. It's been a passion for me that we grow a community of practice in their profession, because you're not reflecting and thinking and evolving a profession and the things we do if we're not thinking about it and writing about it. We can talk over beers or all day long, but does that really get change? And so some of the things that have come out from it, I think you know we can point to some members of the guild who've done some writing that have started to change the discussion within the profession. And I think it's pretty awesome to watch.
What are you guys' mission statement from the website, I think that this is really powerful. Exists to gather writers committed to the development of the profession of arms through the exchange of ideas in the written medium, to foster a strong peer ecosystem focused on writing about military affairs through our ability to advocate, collaborate, and promote.
Yeah, that's really kind of driven us from the very beginning. Is everybody's got a story to tell, right? Everybody's got ideas. There's some great ideas about how to fix our army or our air force, and there's also some great ideas about learning, why we do the things we do, or how we cope with the things. I think certainly, as the wars kind of drew on, you're seeing a lot of folks who are using writing, frankly, as therapy, either because they need to tell their story and get it out, or they need to cope with it, and writing becomes, we wouldn't have Lord of the Rings if somebody wasn't dealing with some very deep issues coming out of World War I. They needed to think about in deep ways. So writing sometimes can be therapy as well. But
It's incredibly therapeutic. And you kind of alluded to this a few times, but it really forces you to think through something. Like over my experiences with writing, I've found that I will kind of have an idea about how I think something is, or like an experience that I had, or something that I observe. And then I will go to write about it, and I will be a couple lines into it or a paragraph and be like, oh, that's actually not what I think is at all. Like that,
yeah,
in fact, is completely the opposite of what this is.
no, words matter, and I don't know, maybe it's because of cognitive issues or what, but sometimes when you see your own words in writing, one is you're forming the words and forming the sentences and the paragraphs and the argument. You have to really think about the argument and think about what it is. And sometimes when you see it in writing, you're right. You're like, oh, that's not what I meant. Or, and this is where the sharing it matters. So, I may have an idea about something, and I may think that I've argued for it well, or laid it out pretty clearly because it makes sense to me. But then you share it with someone else, and all of a sudden, either one, they bring in a new perspective, or two, they don't see it the way you explained it. And so you have to go back and clean it up, and either take in their perspective, or explain it in a way that makes sense to someone who's not occupying that chaos inside your mind, because we all think differently.
It humbles you in more ways than one. And I think when you talk to people who are consistent writers, either in private or publicly, there's something that is unique about that person, that they're trying to better themselves in some way. And I think that
Yeah.
that's really admirable and like critical to like our own self-development.
And some people don't even publish, right? Journals, diaries. If you think about your, diary as a teenager, it was to help you cope. It was to help you think through challenges that you were facing, right? And as adults, we carry around green notebooks, and so so they look more professional. We don't call them diaries, but that's what they are. They're the place where we write down our thoughts and our ideas, and then as we reflect on them, sometimes we think, maybe this is something worth sharing with others.
How many members do you have in the guild, and what do you think the value is that's offered to people who are a part of it?
Both are tough questions. One, just because I can't remember the number off the top of my head. We have several hundred members. The value one is tougher. I see the benefits. I see some of the work that's coming out of our members and some of the collaboration. We certainly amplify. We've got, I forget how many followers we have now on Twitter, but we have quite a few. And so as our members write articles or books or whatever, we try to help them share their ideas with other people, by amplifying it, by retweeting or sharing it. So I think that's probably, if you think about it from a very rational perspective, that's one of the benefits. But then the collaboration, I think, is the other biggest. So if you look at over the last several years, there have been several anthologies that have come out, with multiple writers. In a lot of cases, they're members of the Writers Guild who know each other through the guild. And so sometimes, it's hard to say, oh yeah, that book came out because they're in the guild. But I certainly, every time I see an edited book come out of military writing, I go and take a look at the authors, the contributing authors, and most of the time there's a handful of Writers Guild members, and so I hope that in some way we've helped connect those writers
What do you think the future of the guild looks like? Where would you like to see it in the next 5 or 10 years?
So where we are right now, establishing as a nonprofit and trying to, one of the things that the board has been talking a lot about is sort of that value proposition question you just raised, right? Is at some point we're probably going to have, it's right now membership is free. The only way we raise money, frankly, is through like Amazon Smile, which you can, donate to a nonprofit through that. It doesn't cost you anything. And so Amazon can save money on taxes. But at some point, we'll probably will go to some sort of dues paying membership. And that's probably going to cut our membership, right? That's why, when you ask the question of how many members do we have? Well, we have a whole bunch of members because people have asked to be in at some point. But because we don't require dues, there's no mechanism really to like weed people out over time that may or may not be participants. And so I think the dues will kind of change that. But I don't want to start having dues until there's a value proposition, until people understand, yeah, this is absolutely worth that. And I think part of that is improving our methods for collaboration. I think part of that is improving our outreach and our advocacy. So if you look at, writing workshops, those sorts of things, and there are some ways now as we kind of evolve and look at, like this conversation we're having right now, you can do that through Zoom and through other means because we are such a distributed organization. But I think growing that part, I think that recognitions. So I think there is absolutely some value in organizations that recognize, the best journal article or the best poem or the best whatever that came out this year in military writing. I think that's something that at some point as an organization we'll probably go into, but that takes money. And it's hard for an organization that's all nonprofit and also all volunteer. Nobody on our board or nobody in our organization is paid anything. In fact, being on the board probably costs money because we tend to be the ones that pay for some of those subscriptions and some of those things that help us, or that overhead that help us do things. But
Mhm.
that's where I see it going.
I don't think that you need to sell me on the value of writing and what that does for an individual. But for somebody that's maybe wanting to get started writing and maybe is convinced of the value, but struggles getting started, making it a habit, or staying consistent with it, have you found anything that's helpful for overcoming that hump?
So we did an anthology here a couple of years ago called Why We Write. And we brought in, it's edited by a couple of folks who are on the board of the Writers Guild, and I wrote the introductory chapter, but we brought in, I think it was like 40 authors who wrote a chapter on why they do what they do. And what struck me, because at first I wasn't sure, like, who's going to read a book about why we write? And they all had a different story, right? They all had a different reason for doing it. You start to see some themes. You start to see this desire to share things they've thought about or ideas they have. But even in the way they wrote their chapters, so we just say, hey, send us a chapter on why you write. Some of them wrote it as a science fiction story, right? Like literally, like made it a story, and others wrote it very differently. So there is a variety. For every person, there's a story, and for every story, there's a way to write. So I think you have to think about what's your story, think about what matters to you, and that changes over time. If you look at the handful of things that I've written publicly, I've written more behind the scenes than I have publicly. But if you look at some of the things that I published, some of them they're on some random topics because that was something that at the time I was thinking about and thought was worth sharing.
One thing that I find consistent with most regular writers is that they're actually avid readers as well. So, correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm guessing that you read a fair amount. Have you read anything recently, or would you recommend anything for people to check out?
So yes, I read a lot. And I'm usually, and I found this to be true too. Most avid readers are not reading one book at a time. So I typically will have 3 or 4 books that I'm working at a given time, and whatever the mood or the medium. So I also read books in different ways. So there are books that are on my nightstand. There are books that are in my backpack when I go to school. There are books that are to work, and there's also I listen to a lot of audiobooks because if I'm running or walking or in the gym or driving in my car, it's an opportunity to learn. So I tend to read also in different groups. So I will tend to be reading some things about my job, or usually about my next job. So I'm the kind of person that if I find out my next job is going to be in Europe, which is kind of where I'm going next, I'm reading. I've got it in front of me. I've got 4 books that I've read here in the last couple of weeks. Actually, one that I just started, but like Putin's People by Catherine Belton, Active Measures by Thomas Rid, The Russian Understanding of War by Johnson, which is a really good way of thinking about how Russians are thinking about war. And then that drove me to another book, Strategia, which is a translation of some sort of key strategic thinkers in Russia, because I'm really trying to wrap my head around why Russia does what it does, and what, why do they think about things the way they do think about things, because I think it's different. But then I'm also reading something. I'm also usually trying to read stuff to make me a better person, to kind of fill some gaps. So I'll be honest, the last book I just finished was a epic biography of Frederick Douglass. That was sort of a part of our history that I'm a little bit less familiar with, but also he's a great writer and orator, and so that kind of drew me to him, and I really enjoy it because frankly the prose matched the story, in the sense that the author did such a good job, not just of highlighting how well Frederick Douglass wrote and spoke, but also his story. I thought the author did a good job of sort of matching that capability, and that's a tough one. I don't think I could write about another writer, because you gotta be writing. When you got a long quote from them, you got to the rest of your own writing has to match that quality. So I enjoyed that, but I enjoy biographies. I think I had a general officer one time was asked what books to read on leadership. And the first thing he said was, if it's a book on leadership, don't read it. He's like, read biographies, right? Look at people that you admire, that got through adversity, and see how they did it. And I think biographies give us a deeper understanding of sort of how to lead, and also the humanity of people. Frederick Douglass wasn't perfect. There's some parts of his life that were challenging. The same could be said of Eisenhower or Grant or Sherman. And also, people fail, right? People have a hard time. If you look at Eisenhower's jobs leading up to the position that he was in, a lot of them looked like dead end jobs, but those dead end jobs made him uniquely suited to the job that he later got. Grant failed. Grant failed a lot early in his life, but I think those failures probably led to his success. And so, as we look at our own life, and I've got my share of failures as well, some of which we talked about today, but failing isn't the end, and in some ways it makes you better for something down the road, and you never know what that's going to be.
Do you have any closing thoughts for anybody, I guess, current service or former, that would help make them a better soldier?
I'm going to tell them to write for the reasons we said. It helps you think about. I would also say write about what you know. So if you're a platoon leader, write about being a platoon leader. I'm a strategist now, so I'm going to start writing about strategy. There is something about your experience. There's something about your job or where you are, or something you've done that's worth sharing with others. And as you think through that experience, you think through that, put the effort and reflection that it takes to put it in writing, and then to share it with others, and get that feedback that comes from that will make you a better soldier. It'll make you a better officer, or enlisted, or whatever it is you are. But it will make you. I think it'll make you a better professional.
Chris, I'm really thankful that you took the time to chat with me today. Where can people go if they want to learn more about you, connect with you, any kind of social media you want to plug or anything like that?
Yes, the easiest place to find me is on Twitter at Chris G. Ingram. The Military Writers Guild is out Mill Writers Guild. Twitter. We also have a Facebook account for the Military Writers Guild, where you can find us there. And I look forward to engaging with folks. I enjoy the conversations. Twitter. People talk about Twitter. Twitter is writing too, right? If you look at some of the conversations and some of the things that people have, it forces you to think and concise. And you definitely get some immediate feedback on that writing. So I enjoy the dialogue there, and look forward to chatting with folks. The thing I tell people about Twitter, because I hear a lot of officers like, I'm not on social media, or Twitter's full of crap. And hey, Twitter is like life. Where you end up depends on who you follow.
Hmm.
Like you can curate a feed of intellectual. Like the thing that surprised me about it is the number of writers, journalists, think tank, senior administration officials. Right, like there's a lot of people that are currently, very high positions in the administration that are on Twitter officially, but frankly, they were on Twitter a few years ago unofficially. And that dialogue and that discussion, Twitter makes me smarter every day. But that really does go back to who I follow, and that's if your Twitter feed is full of crap, then maybe it's a reflection of who you follow.
This has been a really compelling conversation. Chris, thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.